In this past year, we've seen an increasing amount of demonstrations taking place in the United States, be it opposition to the war in Iraq, the war in Afghanistan, opposition to, bank bailouts, auto bailouts. People have different opinions about healthcare reform. It seems like there's a louder voice of criticism, but it doesn't really create any kind of tangible difference. It seems as though the elected officials are not really paying much mind to the people who elected them. In your opinion, what causes a change?
Crippling the economy, that causes a change. When you damage the money flow, if you're gonna go to war with somebody, you have to attack the supply line, In Central America, the supply line was the people. So the horrifically brilliant tactic they had was, if you kill the wife and child, the child will never grow up to be a guerrilla. So that's the origin of right-wing death squads. What we have in our midst is them saying, where do we attack their supply line? Their supply line is information. Let's flood all the information in the world out there. Fine, you can say whatever you want, you can confront whoever you want, but you're still not attacking our supply line, and that's the money. The money's continuously rolling in, whether it be from contractors, whether it be from God knows how many other corporations, not just oil, but all of these other natural resources that we're prostituting from all these other places, where we deal with governments that are kleptocracies in Africa, where we install somebody that's just put there in order to make sure that business goes on as usual. As long as these things remain in place, there will be no fundamental change. And I think that's what people need to understand. When the USSR splintered up, it wasn't because America dropped a bomb on it. It was because of an economic problem, a vast economic problem, an infrastructure. And I think that's not being addressed here. If we want to cause some sort of change, it's not just violent demonstration or screaming or yelling that needs to occur. It needs to be an economic plan. I think that on one hand, it also needs to be a form of self-sustenance where we no longer rely on the government for certain things. But I think that, as people would call it, corporate terrorism, where we say, hey, we're not buying your product and we're going to label your product a cancer to our society, and we'll be willing to do business with someone else who's willing to take our concerns into consideration.
It's been reported over and over again that Obama is hoping to continue the Bush-era tactics against terrorism, extending the Patriot Act, indefinite detention. This is a president who campaigned on change, who promised that the United States of America would no longer torture.
I think it means a very harmful blow to democracy. I think the people are confused about what democracy really is. Democracy is not voting 25 times every century. Democracy are those institutions that are set up to protect the civil liberties of the people. And when you begin to slowly erode those, it doesn't matter the size of the conflict. It doesn't matter if we're at war with China or we're at war with Afghanistan. For example, Chechnya is the size of Massachusetts. What's justified in another country based upon the size of that conflict? It's confined to a small area, and yet the things that are justified in terms of its war crimes and in terms of what it's done to the people there begin to ripple over the entire region. What we're doing in Afghanistan, what we're doing in our own hometown, although it may be a very small area where it begins, that's going to ripple out to other places when we say, okay, we're using Homeland Security to chase terrorists. But really now we see that the majority of these cases are built around immigration. So who are you really chasing? If we're having federal informants that are put out there to give information on terrorism, and the majority of these cases are built around them giving information about illegal immigrants, then who are we really targeting? And who do we consider a terrorist? And what does it really mean to break the law in America because we don't have a passport to be here? Well, did you have a passport when you came here? Did you have a passport when you stole those people's lands? Did you have a passport when you indoctrinated them? We talk about Obama indoctrinating people. The children of Native Americans were taken from them when they were 6 or 7 years old and then put into boarding schools to re-educate them in an ethnocide manner,
As a New Yorker, I want to ask you a question about democracy. We have these elections coming up with Mayor Bloomberg running for a third term, and he and the city council extended term limits without putting a referendum before the people. And now this is a billionaire who's spent well over $110 million to remain in power for another 4 years. What does that say about democracy, and how do you feel as a New Yorker living through this?
I think it's interesting that Michael Bloomberg is a registered Republican, and that the Republicans love to bash anything that appears left-wing. And they had a field day attacking Hugo Chavez. And yet, even he had a referendum, which he, by the way, didn't get, to run again. So even he put it to the people themselves, rather than bypassing the people and saying, you know what I'm gonna do? I'm gonna go to this elite group of individuals. That he has circumvented democracy itself. But then again, I think that's the nature of what we deal with here in the United States of America. For people who don't know, who look at it from the outside, who say, oh, it's a democracy. A democracy is the rule of the people. What we have is a federal republic where we have elected representatives that create a buffer of power between the people and between a system that was set up by people. Because when we talk about government, government's just a word. It's really just people that rule over other people. You know, even in the utopian ideal of communism, there are still some animals that are more equal than other animals. You know, there are still some people that have certain rights above others. There are certain military officials, for example, that'll get special treatment over other people. And I think that this is no exception, that we're not looking at something different. We're looking at something that's very much the same. We're looking at the iron law of oligarchy that states that no matter whether we have a republic, whether we have a communist state, a socialist state, a democracy, whatever it may be, it all boils down and eventually erodes into power being consolidated by a few people. And Bloomberg happens to be one of those few people. So it's just like we're rewinding in time, really. We're not going anywhere forward by presenting his example of corruption.
I read that you consider yourself a socialist guerrilla.
No, that's a thing that's taken out of context. It comes from a lyric that I said, right? So by that means I would also be the Aztec Lecter Hannibal. You know what I mean? I think that when we take lyrics like that and we look at it, I was talking about a particular struggle that exists in Latin America between right-wing death squads and in between people that grew out of this and now create a culture in Latin America where we expose political genocide. Because I think what we begin to see, and this is a longer answer to what you brought up, but I think it's important to note, because I want to let people know, especially here in this venue, and for the people out there in the world, that in Latin America, we know that our revolution did not begin with socialism and communism. And that was an ideal that was given to us in the beginning of the 20th century. You know, our revolution began when our indigenous people were enslaved, when our religion was destroyed, when our women were raped, when we lost 100 million people during the first 100 years of the occupation, when our lands were claimed. And I think that when we were first introduced to these new ideas, what we chose was the idea of democracy. Because people said, hey, look, we can vote for our own presidents, we can control our own lands, we don't have to listen to these aristocrats anymore, the old ways are dead. And we believed that. We believed it like a broken-hearted woman that believes another man that says, I love you and I'm always gonna take care of you. And finally, we realized that we can call him a president, but if you're in power for 40 years, and this extends itself not just to Latin America, but also to the Middle East and everywhere else, if you're in president for that many years, if nothing's changing in terms of agrarian reform, then you can call yourself Caesar, you can call yourself the Grand Duke of whatever. It doesn't matter what your title is. You hold an authoritarian position. You have a totalitarian government in place. And when we realized that the prognosticator of democracy was telling us on one hand, listen, you can be free and you can vote for your own people. And on the other hand, the same person who had fed us this ideal of democracy was the same person that was holding up and protecting these right-wing dictators, these beacons of abuse of authority. Then we turned away from that and we said, who else is out there? Who else is putting something on the table? And that's when people like Russia and China stepped up and said, well, here, there's another ideology that we have in place. But even if we look at Karl Marx in the beginning of that ideology, we notice that he took things from other places. We indigenous people in Latin America and Africa didn't need a European man from 100 odd years ago to explain the complex concept of sharing to us. We know what collectivism was for thousands of years. So I think that when we talk about socialism and its reaction, its violent reaction to American imperialism, we're really talking about the failed dream of democracy that was promised to our people and that we were lied to about consistently for 100 years almost.
Tell me about the charity work you're doing in Afghanistan.
I used proceeds of The Third World, the most recent album that I did, to fund a school and an orphanage in Afghanistan, in Kabul. And I went there earlier this year to oversee the final stages of construction. So I had to physically go there, and it was an ordeal to get into the country. But I think that it definitely showed me the sacrifice that people are willing to go to live free. Like, when you look at the region, when you look at the area, you can see the tremendous amount of human cost that was taken from these people in order for them to try and have some sort of independence, or what they saw as independence, because America, I think, was instrumental in giving them the idea that they were fighting for God, when really what they wanted to do was to bleed Russia as much as possible, which was America's agenda. Afghanistan's agenda was to be independent, was to have a government that wasn't controlled by one side or the other, but being that its strategic location is connected to Pakistan, it shares a border with the former Soviet satellites, it shares a border with China, it shares a border with Iran. Just the fact that it's right in Central Asia makes it one of the most important countries to control. So all of these things were kind of brought to light as soon as I got there. And of course, the hospitality of the people was incredibly overwhelming. You know, I met people from both sides of the fight, people that had fought for Dr. Najib, people who had fought in the jihad, that were there saying, listen, I was fighting for my God, for my people. And I felt as if I was abandoned afterwards. So I learned a lot by actually seeing it, by seeing the huge parking lot and truck yards full of the evidence of a civil war, the evidence of a guerrilla incursion, the evidence of urban warfare, you know, which coincidentally is the title of the documentary that I'm doing.